giving me the opportunity to, modestly at different points contribute to this network, which I think is very, very important and dear to me, although I usually cannot commit the time that I would like to, which also has to do, of course, with the ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine. We at the Institute, and Christoph, I think, in Potsdam can confirm this, we sort of have a small Historians Without Borders now in our department because we took many refugees from Ukraine and from Russia and initially also from Belarus during the pandemic. Although it's sometimes not easy, try to work together, and we hear much more Russian and Ukrainian in our offices and on our floors. But even in this microcosm, we can see that, during times of war, unfortunately, this is not always easy, and sometimes misunderstandings, even in this small microcosm, have to be resolved. Why I'm saying this, I think, one thing that we should also reflect is that, unfortunately, if we look over the last 10 years, things have not exactly gotten better. I guess in many ways for us as scholars or activists, and personally, I find it sometimes quite challenging to draw the line between my own professional work, which despite the dire circumstances, of course, I cannot go to archives in Russia anymore. I can travel to Ukraine, but it's quite difficult. I have to take vacation time because it's not a official trip, because I wouldn't get funding from the university for official trips. So I'm going on my vacation time to conferences on my own money to Ukraine. So all of this, these are of course restraints, compared to the war and to the repression in Russia. I'm not complaining that this is a big deal. I should say that, but still, we should see how much more difficult our work has become as historians. Last year in November, almost exactly a year ago, the German Associations of Historians of Eastern Europe, or DGO, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Osteuropakunde, has been declared an extremist organization by the Russian Foreign Ministry. And all their members are extremists. So I'm some sort of Taliban talking to you because, it sounds funny, but actually it isn't. Because if I went to Russia, which I'm not planning to do at this point, without trial, I could go to a lager for 10 years as an extremist. And of course, I have, for example, Russian PhD students who work for me who are in exile here, talk about historians in exile. And just by being in contact with me, they could also go to prison for 5 years in Russia just by contact guilt, I guess. This is sort of like in the Nazi times when you don't commit the crime yourself, but someone from your family, and you get arrested for that. So that's the times that we live in. I think that I've talked about it at another occasion a couple of weeks ago, that we German East Europeanists, we are now historians working within a hybrid war. I think we have to face that. We shouldn't make the situation nicer than it is. It doesn't impact us every day, of course, as it does the Russian or the Ukrainian colleagues, but we are also part of this. And this is what structures our work. And this is, of course, also something that we have to think about when we think about the important projects of dialogue, but we can also clearly see what are the limits of these more or less discursive approaches. I think there's also this is also a time where sometimes you have to take sides, where you can not only be discursive or Habermasian about all the problems in our world, and we should emphasize that the work of historians in authoritarian states, or I would call Russia today more or less a neo-totalitarian state, whatever that is, or dictatorship, at least a personal dictatorship, is much different from the work that we do here in more or less open societies. And all of these facts, how does that impact our work, and how does that impact the ambitions of an organization like Historians Without Borders, that we live in a very different world, I think, from 10 years ago. This is not to spoil everything, of course, but maybe put some water in the wine and also make us think about, what is actually needed, and what are the specific conditions that we live and work in, because, over my lifetime, and especially in the last 10 years, I think they've changed a lot, and not necessarily for the better. When I was a history student, to be quite honest, in the 1990s, I wanted to be mostly apolitical historian when, if that was possible at all. At least I had this illusion, because what I thought I learned, because there was a big discussion in the 1990s in this country about what the historians under National Socialism had done and what the historians in the GDR had done. And I'm sure, I was quite sure that I didn't want to go into any of these directions. So I was actually very much not opposed, but let's say skeptical of too much public activism of historians. And this is one of the things that we should discuss, how much does this, where can we positively contribute? And I'm contributing at this point a lot. I've been in the media. I started a podcast. Who doesn't have a podcast these days? This is what people do. I try to educate people about Ukraine, because Ukraine is a black hole in Germany. Nobody knows anything about Ukraine. So we did a whole series of lectures on Ukraine, but also on. We prepared material for schools about Ukraine that teachers can download and all this sort of stuff. But we also see, of course, the limits of this work, and maybe internationalization is, of course, one of the ways to go, or surely internationalization can help and should help and will be necessary to achieve further funding. On the other side, I see that my time at this point is often consumed by the very practical necessities, because we don't have, for example, in this country, a support system for historians in exile, or very limited options for historians in exile. Let's say there's not nothing. But my colleagues and I in Potsdam and at Viadrina, we spend a lot of time writing applications for very concrete people who are already here, so that they can keep their work as historians and don't have to drive an Uber or so. And this is something where I would say also on the international level, maybe on the level of the EU, something has failed, because we have not created institutions for all these people who had to leave their countries, right? I mean, in the old days, when the German social scientists and historians had to leave during the Nazi time, things came out of this, like the New School of Social Research in New York. Where's our new school for Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Iranian historians? Doesn't exist, right? So we have also failed in, I think, creating something new out of these very precarious situations for many colleagues. Or there are lots of initiatives. Of course, there's Historians Without Borders. There are many other people who are doing something, but I don't see the broad umbrella under which actually on a supernatural level people are being helped. And I think Historians Without Borders can certainly contribute to that, but it also has to be. We also have to work every day, I think, for awareness within the political sphere, so that our politicians. I've tried to do that. I mean, most recently, I talked to Olaf Scholz, who is now a deputy from Potsdam and not a chancellor anymore. And again, I get the same reaction as Erki. People are very interested and they listen to me, but they don't necessarily get their wallet out of their pocket or want to commit to something like that. Although they acknowledge that there is a problem with the exiles that we have in this country, but also in Europe, and with the lack of organization and funding for them. And although we can see that if this nightmare with Putin is ever going to end, we're going to need these people to stay in our profession, as you said, with a possible conflict resolution. I mean, most of my Ukrainian friends would not want to go that direction at this point. But, there will be maybe a different time in the future. They're not too fond of being in a room with too many Russians, but, at least not publicly. So all these difficulties, I think, need to be addressed. Needs to be addressed, the difficulty of, how much time we have on our hands to fundraise on top of everything else that we can do. But we should also see that we maybe take another step take on more commitments, see, how maybe it's not only national chapters, but it's also, working together with Dutch and German and, Central European historians can be very productive. And I think there is a lot going on. But we also see that one of the things that sometimes restrain us, that of course our judicial systems are very different. It's something very different to create an organization in Holland. I learned this because there are friends of mine, Ellen Rutten from Amsterdam University, is trying to also found an organization for Russians who have come to the Netherlands, and I learned from her that it's very different what you do in Holland than to get an eingetragener Verein, so a club in Germany. All these things are very different, and if we take this seriously, we also would have to talk about formats actually that are compatible. I'm not quite sure actually what the format of Historians Without Borders within the Finnish legal framework is. But all of these things, are to be discussed if we take this seriously and take this to another level. This said, I think, sometimes it's maybe also easier to focus on concrete projects, and I very much think that this project about historians in exile is very important, and it should be carried on. But we should also ask, what can be our task as historians, not necessarily only, I think, in conflict resolution, as this conflict at this point, there is no resolution. It's being fought out on the battlefield. We have to also face that. People who don't face that reality also, I think, have a problem with analyzing our reality. This is at this point not a conflict that we can resolve. But I was, for example, very impressed when I was in Ukraine in May and June in Lviv and Kiev. Watching or participating also in the work of Ukrainian historians who do very concrete historical work in documenting the conflict and the war crimes. So this is actually not so much maybe about conflict resolution, but it's also judicial work, because it's, something that they're producing material that can be used in the future to have an idea about what actually happened during this war. And they're doing it under very, very difficult circumstances. And I also found this sort of work very, very admirable that they're doing. It was my first historical conference that I ever attended where there was a air alert and we all went to the bunker together. So that was very peculiar. In Kiev, we were all not very well slept in the morning because we also had to spend the nights in the bunker. So this is the reality, actually, I think, that East European historians have to work under at this point. And maybe we should also ask, I don't know what is planned, actually, what can be the product of the work of Russian historians in exile, and I think it would be very, obviously, maybe documenting the crimes of the Putin regime or the way historical academic work has changed in the last 10 or 20 years in Russia. Also, this could be very important. So actually work of historians, not only in conflict resolutions, I think this is something for the future, but in documenting what is going on and then making our voices heard. I think last week I got an anthology of Russian writers by a writer friend of mine, which is called Russian Voices Against the War. And it's different Russian writers, basically novelists, essayists, who have written, small essays against the war. And I think, something similar maybe could be done by Russian historians. I think this would be very much welcomed, and it would also be something that could possibly pave the way for Russian historians to come back into the international community of historians, where, of course, especially the standing of those who, for good or worse reasons, have remained in Russia, is of course problematic. Let's face that, right? Let's be honest about this. This is not an ideal situation in so many ways, and we also know, what the future will hold. We just have to look back at German history. Whenever this nightmare is over, the people who will return from exile, they will not be welcomed, right? Because the Germans who came back from the exile in the United States and so on, These were not the people that people wanted to talk to in the 1950s, the Adornos and the Horkheimers and so on. They were very much the outsiders. The profession was run by the people who stayed during National Socialism, of course, right? I mean, that's the way it works. Let's be honest about this. And not everyone will return to the homeland. Not all of the Ukrainians who are here will be able to return or will be willing to return. Not all of the Russians who are here will be willing to return. So all of these realities, I think we need to face on very straightforward in order to be productive and, maybe take one step after another, what we can actually do. And I'm happy. I've said enough. You can bring in your own perspectives now and comments and hopefully productive suggestions about what can realistically be done. But let's stay with both feet firmly on the ground, as I think that we are in a more difficult situation that the German public is acknowledging here in Potsdam and throughout the country. If I tell people the bitter truth that between us here speaking freely, which we take for granted, and Putin is only the fighting Ukraine and the Polish army, right? We hardly have an army in Germany, right? This is the reality that we have to talk about, actually, right? This is where we are. We have drones flying over Poland. That's 80 miles from here, right? I mean, it's not a very comfy situation, and we don't know where it's going to end. And so far, we have seen more escalation than anything else. And I think it will not be easy to find the place as historians, especially for me as a specialist in the region also, that is appropriate, but also to, keep our head at the sand, obviously, should also not be an option. Thank you very much.